situation here where we have two worlds. You have China's world, and then you have the rest of the world. And that's how China looks at it, too. They have a domestic world that they control. They control everything. They're desperately short resources. No one accepts RMB as payment because it's just funny money. China purports to be the second largest economy in the world at 15% of global GDP, and yet less than 1% of cross-border settlements in the world settle in RMB. I think they could have their world of make-believe, of printing RMB and running their economy and convincing the world, but the denominator is inflation, so they massively underreport inflation. That's just a fallacy, but I think that can go on for a long period of time, as long as they're growing their reserve balance, as long as they're growing their working capital, which is imports and exports, FX reserves, they can keep playing with their domestic economy and playing with the printing press. If you look at industrial activity, we're going to skip forward but if you look at pure subcomponents of China's industrial production, they've been contracting their economy. They contracted their fiscal impulse beginning Q1 of 2016. They were running a 15% of GDP fiscal deficit at the end of 2015. From now on, we'll have a negative current account.
Right.
They're starting to look more and more like Argentina and Turkey and the other twin deficit countries. Because what are they doing? They're running a negative current account. They're running a negative fiscal balance of roughly 9% of GDP. So they're running twin deficits. Their FX reserves are dwindling. And they're starting to borrow a lot of dollars.
So how much of the FX reserves is liquid out of what's left?
So, you look at U.S.
What's the composition of that now?
Well, first of all, if you remember, when they were let into the IMF SDR basket, they said they would disclose the composition of their reserves within 2 years. Well, that was a long time ago, and we haven't seen it. So we think that their only liquidity that they have any size of is our treasuries. Is dangerously below adequate level. The broad measure of credit in the Chinese financial system is $48 trillion worth of RMB. They only have $2 trillion of reserves. So without Western capital flowing into China, China can't hold this all together. But what's interesting about China is this gives them the confidence globally to be more geopolitically assertive in their dealings. It's given their military the ability to be much more assertive in the South China Sea. And it's given he's made the West think that somehow his economy, his economic model is superior to that of Western capitalism. And it's all a facade. The whole thing is a mirage. The whole thing is made up with the printing press, keeping a closed capital account, and hoping the world doesn't notice it. I think whether you're looking through the National Security Council or the U.S. Trade Reps Office or the Department of Commerce or the U.S. intelligence agencies or the president and his own views, I think everyone has finally come to a conclusion, independently and yet collectively, that a global reset of our relationship with China has to be had. It's the militaristic aggression in the South China Sea. Right. It's their industrial policy that circumvents WTO rules. It's espionage and theft and the lying, cheating, and stealing that the Chinese do. We have to figure out how to stop it. We were just talking about their reserve number might only be $2 trillion.
That's right.
So if they're going to lose another $100 billion a year in tariffs, that's a real problem.
The Hong Kong banking system is now almost 9 times their GDP. Wow. Of the, call it today, it's 850% of GDP. 280% of GDP of the 850 is lent to Chinese property developers into China. They're the most levered nation in the world with the most expensive real estate in the world, with an economic arrangement with a country that is no longer synchronized. It is a recipe for disaster. Fast forward from 84 to 92, when the U.S. entered its Hong Kong U.S. Policy Act. Both Great Britain and the U.S. treat Hong Kong as its own sovereign, as long as it maintains autonomy autonomy in its economic affairs, in its legislative affairs, and in its rule of law.
But what have they lent against in Hong Kong? Because this has got to be the key, right? So the US is the housing market.
This is the fun one. So of the, call it today, it's 850% of GDP. 280% of GDP of the 850 is lent to Chinese property developers into China. Wow. The rest is lent to domestic SMEs and mortgages.
So of the Hong Kong money, the banking system, is most of that debt?
Oh, yeah.
Debt in China.
Oh, yeah.
Chinese debt.
All I'm saying is domestic private sector credit to GDP is 300%. Banking assets to GDP are 850. So they're the most levered nation in the world, with the most expensive real estate in the world, with an economic arrangement with a country that is no longer synchronized. It is a recipe for disaster. The HKMA had a decision to make, right? Either revalue the peg or suffer a massive debt deflation.
Yeah.
And now their debt was nowhere near what it is today. Fascinating thing about their banking system, their mortgages, their assets, their loans in their system, the substantial majority of all of those loans indexes to 1 month HIBOR, their overnight lending rate, and they all reset every month. So if you look at the IMF's Article 4 review of Hong Kong, the number one risk is the fact that all the loans are floating and indexed to 1 month HIBOR.
So then the other preconception is right now, same as it was back then, is Hong Kong has unlimited balance sheet, the HKMA. You know, because
just 2 years ago, that was about 170 billion Hong Kong dollars. It was real money.
Yeah.
In the last year, they've spent 80% of that money defending the peg. 80.
Wow.
They have 50 billion Hong Kong dollars left. Call it 6 billion US dollars left before all of a sudden they're going to have to make a decision. Now, can they go find some other money in their economy somewhere, somehow, to keep defending the peg? It's actually similar. Do we think that it's anomalous, that this attack is speculators, or is it the macroeconomy telling us that maybe the peg's not pegged to the right thing?
Yeah.
And maybe not the value is the right value.
Yeah. Now, the other question is this is clearly tied into the Chinese story. Is this also capital flight from China via Hong Kong?
In the last few years. But if you remember when China closed the door, really shut down and put their fingers in the holes of the dam of the money running out of China, they did that really at the beginning of 2017. Imagine if you're a Hong Kong family that has been there for generations, and let's say you've built wealth over time. You would have to be foolish. In a freely convertible market, you'd have to be foolish to leave it in Hong Kong dollars, given the macroeconomic instability of Hong Kong. And I sat and talked with you and explained to you how bad the macro is, and then you say, well, it's probably going to be a political situation. So I don't care. I'd rather own US dollars tomorrow. The moment that China started actually floating a proposal to be able to extrajudicially grab someone off the streets of Hong Kong and take them to China without any court proceeding, that's scaring the Hong Kong, not only the Hong Kong elite, but the 85,000 Americans that live there. If this becomes law, more importantly, it goes back to this word autonomy. The Brits agreement with Hong Kong and the U.S. agreement with Hong Kong, for instance, the 1992 U.S. Hong Kong Policy Act is re-ratified annually. So the State Department submits a report to the president, and then it's up to the president to either take the State Department's recommendations or do whatever he wants to do. If he determines that they are no longer sufficiently autonomous, we can treat Hong Kong as China. Well, that changes the entire complexion of Hong Kong's economy. Meaning, all of a sudden, all the tariffs, all the restrictions, all the rules of trade that we engage with China on, we start treating Hong Kong that way. Today, Hong Kong is treated as its own sovereign. There are no tariffs. It's free trade, unabated free trade. And as long as, again, they maintain that autonomy, we honor that agreement. If this law goes through, it is a clear violation of our Policy Act, and it's a clear violation of the Brits' agreement with Hong Kong. So if the wealthy in Hong Kong either convert to dollars or start leaving, which I think both will happen, then Hong Kong's finished.